Good afternoon, everyone. Illinois Extension is happy to host another webinar. We are welcoming the Illinois Broadband Lab here today. I'm Nancy Withdrago, State Specialist in Community and Economic Development with Illinois Extension. We are always very happy to host all of these updates with our hardworking colleagues. I'm happy to welcome Robbie Macbeth from the Illinois Broadband Lab. We are very grateful for this update as we get closer to getting those very important BEAD dollars into the state. We're happy to have the information around the challenge process. So we thank you so much for your time and your expertise and the expertise of all the panel of presenters and colleagues today. And so without further adu, I'll pass it to you now, Robbie.
Great, thank you. Happy to be here with everybody. So to just set the stage, this is a introduction webinar for the BEAD Challenge Process, and it's specifically targeted for nonprofits and community-based organizations. This is part of a couple different webinars that the Illinois Office of Broadband and Illinois Broadband Lab have delivered to specific audiences, because there are kind of slight requests and action items tailored to each. So this is providing a broad overview, specifically around nonprofit organizations across the state. So these are the objectives for today's call. I'm just going to make a quick note. If you have questions that arise as I'm delivering these remarks, feel free to use the chat as kind of a conversation space. I'm going to request different team members that are going to be speaking and part of the Illinois Broadband Lab to just monitor that chat and either note questions for the end or answer them directly there. So objectives for this webinar is really to have you all know what the BEAD Challenge process is and why it's important, and how it may impact local communities, particularly the communities that you may be working with. There is a unique role for nonprofits and community-based organizations to play in the BEAD process, so understanding that unique role is part of it. There are some key terms and definitions that we'll be using that it's important that you all know, and then the ideas that you'll leave with an understanding of how you may want to engage in next steps for this challenge process. So looking at the agenda today, we're just going to provide some context because this is an introductory BEAD webinar about the program and some of those key terms and definitions. Then we'll go into the challenge process of the BEAD program, what it is, why it matters, and your unique role, and then end up with that next steps and resources with a timeline and just kind of where we're headed, so you can kind of start planning accordingly. Okay, so setting the context, this is a picture of us speaking at one of the listening sessions in the spring, though that was for the State Digital Equity Plan. That program and BEAD all came from the same Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. So this is a brief, relatively slide, just showing kind of the main pieces of that legislation, of which the BEAD program is one, but you can see by the numbers the largest by a significant amount program. And the best way to think about it that I tell folks is the BEAD program is really about funding broadband infrastructure, whereas the Digital Equity Act portion of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, is about funding programs that promote digital inclusion and broadband adoption. So you can see those numbers. BEAD, you know, if this isn't your first time hearing about the program, you may know that there's been initial proposals in Volume 1 and Volume 2. There's been revamping of the different maps. This has been an ongoing process to try to secure really as much funding as we can for the state of Illinois. And so that amount has been delivered. It's over $1 billion. So the key thing to know, BEAD program focused on broadband infrastructure, and Illinois has over $1 billion to kind of go through with that. That's what you can see there, 1.04 billion on the left. So the BEAD program is ultimately very similar to the Connect Illinois program that Illinois has been running since 2019, which is also about infrastructure adoption. It's not official, but the kind of colloquial way we are thinking about it is it sort of represents round 4 of the Connect Illinois program, though there are slight differences because this is a program that has to be confined and acted in accordance with the federal government, particularly the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. So what does BEAD stand for? The Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. You'll hear a bad joke frequently, but I do think it's important, which is BEAD without equity is just bad. And so that can kind of just help, remember where these sorts of programs lie and the naming conventions of all this. But I think just connecting BEAD and infrastructure is really the key thing here. So the idea behind it is really, it's kind of the federal government's policy proposal to say, how can we ensure universal coverage across all unserved locations in a state? That's really the goal of the BEAD program is kind of ending that idea that there are unserved locations across the country. And so it's obviously being directed by states. It does, maximize deployment of end-to-end fiber and only using non-fiber where fiber costs are extremely high. That it prioritizes projects providing broadband access to unserved and underserved locations. And we'll get into these definitions next because those obviously matter, what we mean by unserved and underserved, as well as community anchor institutions and equipment for MDUs. And we'll get into these definitions in a little bit. There's going to be a subgrantee process of how the funds ultimately get deployed. But for this webinar specifically, we're focusing again on nonprofits and CBOs. So it's going to be mostly about explaining the program and your role in it. There is also an affordability component to the BEAD program. So if you've been with the Illinois Broadband Lab and the Illinois Office of Broadband, we've done a couple different webinars, this year ultimately on the BEAD implementation because it's been a multi-year process. Like I said, maps have been revised. There's been large-scale map challenges to the FCC fabric map and all these different things because that dictated the allocation to each state. So just a brief update, progress since October. We had a public comment period out for the initial proposal, which was basically kind of the rule book or the forecast for how Illinois was going to be going about the BEAD program. And that specifically, we were looking for feedback on the definition of what a community anchor institution is, updating our lists and maps of those eligible community anchor institutions across the state. A lot of very smart people working very hard on building a BEAD portal for these challenges and for organization of the implementation of the program. And then ultimately kind of refining and getting an easy to use map that incorporates broadband serviceable locations, which will be a key term with the BEAD program in the months ahead. So I'm now going to pass it over to Greg Klaus, the Federal Program Officer in Illinois, to talk a little bit about some of the key terms and definitions with the BEAD program.
Thanks, Robbie. As I mentioned, I'm the Federal Program Officer for Illinois. I work for U.S. Department of Commerce and TIA, and so it's my job to help and support the state as they work on the BEAD and Digital Equity Act grant program implementations. There's a lot of jargon in the broadband industry, starting first of all with broadband, and broadband is high-speed internet. That's what we're talking about here. We want to make sure everyone has access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet access all throughout the state. So some of the key terms: broadband serviceable location, we call it BSL for short. That's a home, a business, a farm, any location that needs broadband, that high-speed internet access. Unserved, our program funds any locations that are considered unserved, and that's locations that have speeds lower than 25 megabits download by 3 upload. You can also think of these as no internet, unserved locations. Underserved, you can think of as slow internet. This is a location that has at least 25 by 3, but less than 100 download by 20 upload. So our program focuses on getting that internet infrastructure to locations that are unserved, that's no internet, and then underserved, that's slow internet. And served are any locations as broadband serviceable locations that have at least 100 by 20. Last is community anchored institutions, which actually, let's switch to the next slide. The state has some ability in how they define a community anchored institution. As part of our grant program, we tell them statutory requirements, and then they can add to it. So the state of Illinois has decided that schools or institutions of higher education are community anchored institutions, libraries, government buildings, think of your big county buildings that a lot of people are gathering and potentially using internet access. Any hospital, health clinic, medical location, facility, public safety location, 911 dispatchers, police stations, fire stations, public housing organizations, and community support organizations. All of these are considered community anchor institutions by the state. And why this is so important is because in the challenge process, the state is requesting help refining the location so that they have the actual names and addresses of all of these CAIs that do not have and need gigabit service. That's 1,000 megabits download and 1,000 megabits upload. Next slide. And I mentioned this before, but our BEAD funding, the state has been allocated $1 billion to connect all those homes and businesses that don't have service. The priority for that funding has to be to go for those unserved locations. And then second is underserved locations. And if there's funding left over, the state can use that to connect these community anchored institutions and provide 1,000 by 1,000 megabits. So that's 1 gigabit. Another key term you'll hear is latency. So we talked about the download and upload speeds, that 100 download by 20 upload. Another key thing is the latency. So when you're thinking of even streaming this Zoom call, is there a lag in when you see my face and when I'm talking? That has to do with latency. And so connection speeds that have a high latency actually are not considered high speed internet. So anything over 100 milliseconds is high latency, and that would not be considered high speed internet and potentially eligible for BEAD funding. If you don't know, try type into your internet browser internet speed test, and you can test your download, upload, and latency to see if your internet is at least 100 download by 20 upload and less than 100 milliseconds latency. And the other key thing is why does this matter? For a lot of businesses and nonprofits and community organizations on this call, the state is really seeking your help in trying to identify locations that don't have internet service and community anchored institutions that need that high-speed, high-capacity internet service. All of our funding, this $1 billion, we get to decide at the very beginning those locations. And that's, once that location list is set, no other locations can be added to the list or funding can be used for it. So that's why we're engaging in this challenge process. We're asking for your help in publicizing this challenge process so that we can refine and make sure that all of the locations that need internet service are listed correctly. And if those that already have it, they should be removed from that list.
Okay,
great.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to move on a little bit more to the specific challenge process portion of the BEAD program that we're going to be diving into. I also just want to say it's really exciting to be spreading the word about terms like latency, because I think there's a lot of confusion around, what does it mean to have high speed internet? It's kind of a poor term at the end of the day. Since there's a couple different factors that are really important as to your quality of connection. So I think it's great just to kind of be educating and looping people into these sorts of speed tests and just kind of general knowledge awareness and raising around broadband concepts as we sort of, raise the level of unserved and underserved, or increase the level of broadband access, as well as kind of knowledge around these tools into the years ahead. So as Greg mentioned, this is an important time to finally get the Illinois map right. It has been refined over several iterations to capture those broadband serviceable locations as well as possible. But this is kind of the final time to really refine it in accuracy, because it'll kind of be set over the next year as the subgrantee process, the distribution of funds, actually starts going into place. So if you're curious, this is what the broadband serviceable location map looks like from a very zoomed out perspective for Illinois. What's interesting is you can see the percentages over there on the right. That's of May 2023. Higher updated maps exist and will be distributed soon with our partner with Connected Nation. So we can kind of dig in to the most accurate and up-to-date information soon. That sort of detail on the technicalities of the challenge process is going to be covered more in depth at the next 2 webinars in December, taking place at this same time the following 2 weeks on December 12th and December 19th. So if you want to get in more into the technical specifics, I would join those webinars or look for the recordings. So as you can see here, it looks, the actual surface area is kind of evenly distributed, but from a population standpoint, especially given those percentages, it's not. So you can kind of identify or look where you are and start to kind of recognize, a lot of those magenta areas are most likely less populated than other portions in the state. You can kind of see some of those green bubbles representing more urban areas. So how does the challenge process impact you? During the challenge process, Illinoisans will have the chance to review the map of broadband availability and tell us whether your household, organization, or apartment's availability is accurate. And that's important because that will indicate which locations are eligible for that $1.04 billion for the BEAD program to be distributed. But not anybody can submit these challenges. And that's really one of the main essential points of this webinar. Is that nonprofit organizations, one of the special essential roles you can play is registering for the challenge process and submitting on behalf of individuals to do so. So if I'm a interested party that has really, really poor internet and I want to submit a challenge, me individually cannot do so through this BEAD process. I would have to either go through a unit of local government or a nonprofit organization. So that is really one of the keys of this webinar. One of the key messages we'd like to get across is one of the ways that you can contribute is kind of leading in being a source for individuals to help them submit challenges. So this challenge part gets a little bit more into the weeds of this program. I'm going to hand it off to Alexis, who's doing a really great job sort of getting all of these things organized for the actual challenge process itself to kind of take over and run through some of these.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the challenging part, understanding what types of challenges can be mounted and the evidence that you need in order to submit these challenges. So just to reiterate, as Robbie suggested, only community anchor organizations, governments, and nonprofits are allowed to mount challenges. So the first step, just to reiterate again, is to make sure that you are registered to be able to participate in the challenge process. And Robbie will share that registration link out again, but we just want to make sure that everybody is registered to participate and also will be joining us for the next few webinars when we'll go over this in greater detail. So on a high level, the challenge types that you could expect an end user, a citizen, just an individual person to mount will fall under these categories. The availability challenge type is whether or not that particular type of broadband service is or is not available. So if you look on the map and it says that your neighborhood has fiber service, but you indeed do not. Speed is another example. the actual speed of the service is below 120 megabits per second for an underserved location or below 25.3 for an unserved. Latency, as Greg explained, the round trip latency of the broadband service exceeds 100 megabits per second. Data caps. So these types of service plans will only allow a user to have a certain amount of data within one type of billing period. NTIA now considers this as marking an address unserved. So data cap challenges are another interesting way to interact with the map. Technology type, for example, the technology listed on the map for this location is incorrect. And business service only. If, let's say, your household seems to be served by gigabit or 2 gigabit fiber service, but that type of service is only listed for business service, and there's no residential service available for you. Next slide. So what evidence can you use to submit a challenge? We'll take availability as one of the examples. So if you have any type of communication with your ISP, or perhaps a screenshot of the provider webpage showcasing that indeed that fiber service is not available to you. A service request that was refused within the last 180 days, such as an email or other communication from a provider. A lack of suitable infrastructure in the area, e.g. no fiber on the pole. I know that some ISPs on the call might be very familiar with where infrastructure is and isn't. A letter or email dated within the last 365 days that a provider failed to schedule a service installation or offer an installation date within 10 business days of a request, or a letter or an email dated within the last 365 days indicating that a provider requested more than the standard installation fee. So all of these anecdotes that those of us working in this space have heard before. I can't get service. My provider says that it's going to take way too long for me to get service, or I can't get service because they say that there's fiber at the node, but they don't have a drop close to my house to be able to get fiber to my home. Collecting these pieces of evidence right now can allow, a smooth challenge process when it does open up. Next slide, please. Okay, so one more doubling down on our evidence that we can submit for challenges. If you want to challenge speed and latency, once again, we can submit a screenshot of the speed test a subscriber, an individual runs, showing speed or latency that's lower, speed that is slower than 100 megabits per second or 25.3 once again, and latency that is greater than 100 milliseconds. And importantly, an attestation, a person answering that they subscribe to the speed tier that they do, or a copy of your internet bill or invoice that shows the speed that they subscribe to. This seems like a very heavy lift. It seems like a lot of engagement, but when we have good evidence and when we have good proof that makes sure that our challenge will be upheld and that those locations indeed will actually be accounted for. Next slide, please. So MDUs is another way that we can engage with the map. And this is particularly, I live in Chicago, and we have a lot of high-rise buildings here, in particular around my neighborhood on the south side, that might only have one broadband provider. What's interesting about MDUs is that you don't need to go to every single apartment building within a building in order to mount an MDU challenge. You can gather a sample of those apartments within one MDU and submit that to the portal as your challenge. So if you can demonstrate that at least 3 units or 10% of the units in the building, whichever is larger, do not match what the map says, then you can flip the entire building, how it's characterized, and make it eligible for funding. So there's a lot of value and engagement with MDUs. And once again, we have the same exact evidence requirements that we do for all of the other types of challenges, which is ensuring that we have screenshots and an attestation of speed tier subscribed by the people engaging and providing this evidence. And I will pass it back to Robbie for slide 22.
Great, thank you. So we're trying to kind of give a broad overview without getting too much into the details because we don't want it to be overwhelming. And also there will be future webinars to kind of go into these sorts of things. So if you have specific questions around screenshots or questions around latency, those will most likely get answered in more detail in following webinars. But I think it's helpful to give a broad overview nonetheless of how the challenge process will work. So the first thing, which can be done now, is you can register. There will be a link dropped in the chat when I get a chance, and it's also at the end of this presentation, and many people have already registered for that. So if you know that you want to take part in that process, that can be done. Then you will look up locations on the map, or by entering an address. So if you know, for example, a resident is unserved by broadband, you want to ensure that that is accurate on the map, you would kind of go do that and see and kind of check to see if that information is wrong, and submit a challenge with evidence on the state portal. That will eventually kind of kickstart a process in which an internet service provider can provide a rebuttal and also provide evidence, and then there's kind of a final determination. There are sort of sub-tiers, kind of logic sub-tiers under each of these, particularly 3, 4, and 5, depending on how the evidence is captured. But for the purposes of this webinar, that's the general overview of things. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what is my essential role as a representative of a nonprofit or a community-based organization? One, I think, is just relying on your expertise and your familiarity with the community. So particularly around the community anchor institutions, there's that, a little bit confusing definition, because it's not just schools, health centers, libraries, and that sort of things. It's also organizations that provide essential broadband services in some capacity to vulnerable populations. So knowing the kind of key community anchor institutions in your community and checking what their broadband connectivity is certainly a way that you can kind of contribute. Similarly, trusted voice. There's a lot of different opinions around government agencies, a lot of different opinions around internet service providers, and a lot of different opinions around even community anchor institutions. But generally speaking, the organizations of nonprofits, community-based organizations often have a lot of that community trust. And that can be really, really important when dealing with something as vital and important as the digital divide, where people may have been scammed or taken advantage of in a variety of ways, or overwhelmed. So having that trusted voice from a nonprofit organization can really go a long way to ensuring that they're accurately portrayed in the map and ultimately available for some of this funding to help reduce the digital divide. And then lastly, generating action. You all are potentially in contact with people. So to have it come from you to say, hey, if you're having broadband issues, this is how you can kind of take part to help your situation. Likewise, we also mentioned local governments. So if there are people representing local governments on this call, if you're getting constituents or residents complaining about broadband access, kind of same thing applies here at the bottom of kind of submitting on their behalf. So what would an example kind of look like for a nonprofit organization that serves, maybe a large community in some location in which there's a lot of underserved or unserved residents? We have an example here. Community members enroll in food and healthcare benefits has heard from residents that a certain apartment building doesn't have high-speed internet in all of its units. So upon learning about the BEAD Challenge process, the CBO educates residents of the apartment building about the opportunity to make sure that the access is correct on the state map. And so, okay, just kind of 10% of the units, we kind of need to know this sorts of things. They might meet with them, complete speed tests, maybe show how to capture a screen grab, and kind of help them ultimately through you submit it through the challenge portal, submit that evidence. And also just kind of working with them to make sure that they feel confident to be able to do so. So as you can see, there are a variety of steps here. It will apply in different ways, but there certainly is a role to play for community-based organizations to be aware of this. And I will note it's going to be a tight window, most likely in January, to do these sorts of things. So if you're thinking that it's going to be a really, really long process, that is not correct. It's going to be pretty short and condensed, again, because these maps have been revised and there needs to be time for rebuttals as well as for the funds to get distributed. Okay, next steps and resources. So here was the promised link to pre-register, go.illinois.edu/BEAD Challenge pre-registration. There's also a QR code that you can use. You can hold your phone up to the screen as if you're ordering at modern day restaurants now. You can kind of get that QR code to pre-register, which will just kind of help keep you in the loop and get your organization in place so that during that window, the challenge window, you're able to kind of quickly and efficiently submit on behalf of residents or community members. And then future upcoming webinars, if you know that this is something that you're really engaged with and want to take part, the next two webinars I think are going to be really important. It's going to dive into greater detail about those types of challenges that Alexis kind of talked about, because there are different details around each that you can do, understanding the maps a little bit more, understanding the speed tests, and then you can actually start practicing and documenting some of those challenges. That's the goal at the end of the day. So you can kind of, because of that tight window, hit the ground running. And then December 19th is going to be basically a deeper dive into December 12th, listening for feedback, what people have, and sort of responding to questions that get raised on December 12th. And then on the DCEO website, if you go to dceo.illinois.gov/connect-illinois, on the left, there's a federal broadband tab that has all the information around the BEAD program, which includes the different initial proposals that basically are the roadmap for how Illinois is going about its BEAD process. So timeline that I mentioned, the challenge process, which is, that's what we're pre-registering. That's what that's the sort of go time for those submissions. Expecting that in mid to late January, lasting at least 14 days. So again, that's a pretty tight turnaround. All of this information is not totally 100% yet set, just because of a lot of different coordinated efforts on behalf of the state of Illinois and NTIA. There's a lot of legal starting points of when things get submitted, so we can't give specific dates yet, but this is the general timeline that we're looking at. So kind of just be thinking ahead around practicing those speed tests, pre-registering, so that in January you can kind of take part in that process. The rebuttal period we're going to talk about in future webinars, but that's just the sort of the opportunity to get to the truth of the matter on behalf of internet service providers, maybe fixing their maps or other things, so that accuracy is the number one concern, and then a final determination, and then final classifications will be shown, which will then kickstart the process of distributing the funds, which is a whole nother part of this equation. Things to be looking forward to that the Illinois Broadband Lab and Illinois Office of Broadband are working on are, there's going to be a landing page with this links and information and fact sheets, as well as outreach materials to kind of help just clarify what's going on with this process, step-by-step guidance for the challenge portal. The BEAD map will be unveiled in the weeks ahead, so you can actually start kind of digging in and looking at some of those BSLs. And then when we'll actually get the final NTIA approval, that will be bestowed with our specific timelines. So again, I made a mention of this at the beginning of the webinar, but as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of information. And so the newsletter, which can be found at go.illinois.edu/Illinois Broadband Connections, there's an archive and a button for subscription. That's really the best way, I think, to stay involved. It comes out every other week on Monday. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I will open the floor for discussion, do a little checking with the chat, and also kind of opening it up to other members of the Illinois Broadband Lab or Illinois Office of Broadband to chime in with anything they think I may have missed, or to start answering some of these questions.
Robbie, we have one question from the chat that is wondering, what is NTIA?
Great question. Greg, I can give my answer, but I feel like as an employee, Greg, you should maybe take this one.
Sure, happy to do it. NTIA stands for National Telecommunication and Information Administration. It's a smaller bureau within the U.S. Department of Commerce, and it's been empowered by the bipartisan infrastructure law to implement the BEAD grant program, which is the $42+ billion grant program to connect all unserved and underserved locations. And also to implement the Digital Equity Act grant programs. So NTIA, a lot of people had not heard of it before the bipartisan infrastructure law passed about 2 years ago. But you could think of it as sort of a sister agency to the FCC, which most people are a little bit more familiar with.
We have another comment in the chat that says, this is pretty high expectation for some folks who already don't have a lot of cycles to begin with. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there are any comments about kind of, why it's important and valuable to do this bit by bit in preparation for January.
So sorry, I'll take that if I'm understanding the question. I was reading some of the chat questions as well. What is the importance of kind of how the process is laid out and doing it bit by bit versus kind of all in January? Is that the question?
If you have any advice for those of us, and I know that so many of us wear multiple different hats. I'm the director of a nonprofit myself. This is pretty onerous. This is a big lift. But what's the value in engagement now? And how do you think that you could advise people to kind of wrap their arms around this?
Yeah, I think it's a tough program just I think because of that short window of the challenge process. And so because of that kind of tight window, I think the more work that can get done ahead of time and the engagement that happens now will enable that process to go smoother and more efficiently. So if you've practiced doing a speed test or you familiarize yourself with the program and the process of what we're trying to do, the idea is during those, potentially tight 2 weeks, you can kind of hit the ground running and just be aware of what actually needs to happen. It's kind of the same thing of the value of having a pre-registration now rather than kind of opening it when the window starts for the same reason of just getting ourselves organized in place so that you can kind of just be most successful when the time comes in January to actually participate in the challenge process. Yeah.
So another question that I can answer is someone asked if they've registered, but they would like to update their information, what could they do? And my advice is please register again and fill out the form with the most complete information that you have. And when we go to do data cleaning, we will work in partnership with the state to ensure that if there's anything confusing about it, we'll reach out to you personally.
I also, it's as far as kind of context that may be helpful for people. This is, it's a huge amount of money. We are talking about $1 billion, but it isn't really the only infrastructure dollars that will be there. As I mentioned, the Connect Illinois program has been running that has a little bit of a broader scope of different projects that can be funded. And I say that only in the sense of a question that I saw around looking at a map and identifying it as being mostly green. It is true that BEAD is focused on that kind of unserved and underserved, but there certainly is still value in ensuring that this map is as accurate possible. Yes, for the BEAD program, but also just for subsequent kind of data around broadband access across Illinois. Same with community anchor institutions. Even if your community anchor institution, gets added to the list, it determines it has less than gig speed. Maybe it doesn't get that funding depending on how the unserved and underserved priorities work with the BEAD funding. It's still valuable for the state of Illinois to understand that connecting or that community anchor institution with its gig speeds. So there isn't a guarantee necessarily that your participation in the BEAD challenge process will 100% mean that the funding will go to that area in a particular way, but it does certainly increase the odds and sort of the long-term approach of higher accuracy and connections for the state. So that's also something to kind of be thinking about is, yes, we're all talking specifically about the BEAD program. And the BEAD program is a very large one, but really just one tool in the toolbox that the state has as far as looking at issues like digital divide and larger digital equity initiatives. So I see a couple questions here on high-cost fiber deployment where alternative technologies will be required. That will certainly save, because that gets into more about the actual subgrantee process when you're talking about the types of technology and the bids going on with internet service providers that would be applying for that. So that's for future webinars. What I will say is on that federal government tab on the DCEO website exists the BEAD initial proposal, volume 1 and 2. And those are the documents that, essentially lay the blueprint for the program that will have specifics around questions related to high cost fiber deployment and some of those definitions. I think particularly volume 2 will be where you find some of that information. I got a question. Can the contact person on your registration be changed? I think that's for Alexis.
Yeah, absolutely. If you would please fill out the form again, we will look, and during data cleaning, we'll try to reverse engineer that the organization has 2 contact people. And also I'm going to put my email address into the chat. If you have any questions specifically about the registration instrument, please go ahead and send an email to shrupi@uchicago.edu. That's my last name, SCHRU Bravo Echo @uchicago.edu. Thank you.
And yes, in the subsequent email that Nancy will send out on behalf of Extension, there will be information about the registration or pre-registration link. To be included in there. I see the question about round 3. I assume that's for Connect Illinois. We're not going to get into timelines or deadlines for Connect Illinois, but just understand that I think announcements and coordination with previous Connect Illinois will occur and kind of make sense when BEAD ultimately gets implemented.
And Robbie, there's a question just want to make sure I'm clear. A new updated map will be sent and that will trigger the challenge period to start. So it sounds like there's questions about when people will know the challenge process has started and where they can get that information from. Do you want to take that question or?
Sorry, I am reading multiple streams of phones and other chats. Could you repeat the question for me?
Sure. There's a question. Just want to make sure I'm clear. A new updated map will be sent and that will trigger the challenge period to start. So they're asking the process.
Yes. So a new map will come out. That won't trigger the process, but there will be a new map showing the broadband serviceable locations, which is being conducted with Connected Nation right now. And actually, also in reference to that Connect Illinois question, that type of information around updated service based on Connect Illinois projects is also being incorporated into the larger kind of BEAD challenge map, Illinois challenge map. So it would be great, I think, if it was out right now, but there's a reason I think that we're, waiting is ultimately to get it as accurate with as much data and information as possible. Again, given the importance of the BEAD program. So the new BEAD challenge map will be out in the next several weeks. That won't kickstart the challenge process, but that'll obviously happen before the challenge process does start. What kickstarts the challenge process is ultimately approval and coordination with the NTIA or with NTIA.
And I think
Great.
one of the important takeaways is not to wait for the map or a certain product to come out to start engaging with community members or organizations who might have information about where the least served parts are, because the data sources are, constantly being updated and our lives change all the time. So we have to be in a million different places at once, and everybody's buy-in is such an important part of this process. So we really appreciate all of the help that everyone on this call will be providing.
Another question I'm looking at was, how does an internet service provider, an ISP, submit challenges when we don't know the results of round 3?
Yeah, I think I tried to answer that in the sense of that information is kind of being contributed to the larger BEAD challenge map. So that's sort of kind of behind the scenes work going on. Yeah.
And just to clarify, the BEAD challenge process is open to any nonprofit, any government organization, and any internet service provider. So this is really an all call to get the map as accurate as possible in order to use the BEAD funding to connect all those people that don't have internet service. So if you're an ISP, you should engage in the challenge process when it opens and do the pre-registration now that Robbie and Alexis have already mentioned.
Any other final questions for our panel today? We're really thankful for your time. It's a great introduction to, what we're going to be doing in the next month or so, in order to really put a focus on eligibility and empowerment, right? For our communities to be able to access the funding that they need. And so really thank you for your time. Want to make sure you've got, enough time to give any last takeaways, and any remaining questions can be put in the chat at this time. Otherwise, I am okay with giving folks their 8 minutes back that remains of the hour. And so, Robbie, do you have any further comments?
I just saw this final one about the community anchor institutions for unserved and underserved files. They will be updated. So this image that's on this slide shows the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity website. On the left-hand side there, you can see federal broadband, that entails, the BEAD program, which you can see there, which has the initial proposals, volume 1 and 2, which I mentioned, which kind of go into detail with some of those more specific questions about challenges and rebuttals. But also you'll see BEAD eligible CAIs and all Illinois CAIs. Those are massive CSV files. And so those will be updated when we kind of had the final list there. But if you're curious, they exist there as well.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great website to peruse. There's actually quite a lot on there for the different programs and resources as well. Got one more question about
being updated now.
Yep.
So there was the CAA process, I think, closed October 31st, was the last sort of like open window. So I believe it's in if someone on the call wants to correct me here, I think it's just in the process of ultimately getting updated. But when the map ultimately gets released, that'll be kind of the best indication where you can kind of put an address for a CAI that you're thinking about it and sort of see what the access level is at that point. So my answer would be it's the update is in process.
Thank you so much. And if there's nothing further, just on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, we're so happy to have NTIA on today, Illinois Broadband Lab. Thank you so much for all of this education. And of course, I'll be sending out a follow-up email to participants and those who registered, and be sure to let everyone know how to contact you all. You're very experienced in this, and we're very grateful that you can provide some guidance. And so I'll be copying your emails on that so that folks can kind of know how to send questions along. Is there a, Robbie, do you prefer to get questions from participants and registrants, or are Greg and Alexis comfortable getting some questions as well? Yes, I'm seeing some nods here.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that willingness to assist. And I think that as we provide this education, folks will really start to get rolling on participating in, what's going to be quite important for our infrastructure planning and our continued closing of the digital divide in Illinois. So thank you so much. Okay, and on behalf of Illinois Extension, hope everyone has a great rest of their week. Thank you for all you do in your counties and communities.
Thank you, everyone.